Is China in the habit of using these kinds of balloons for spying?
Well, countries use balloons for surveillance, spying operations. China would not be an exception in doing that. The Chinese government has, for a very, very long time, been very resentful of the Americans using their surveillance aircraft up and down the China coast, occasionally getting into Chinese airspace.
Mhm.
This is perhaps the Chinese government returning the favor.
What do you make of their refusal? They've accepted that the balloon is theirs, but they insist that it's a weather research balloon that has been blown off course. How feasible is that as an excuse? Has it happened before? Is it feasible that a weather research balloon would be of the same size and scale? And could it indeed be blown off course?
Well, it is possible that a weather balloon would be of that type of size. I don't think there's a problem with that. But if the Chinese balloon was a purely meteorological instrument, they can easily resolve the problem by getting the balloons to land on America with agreement and let the Americans inspect and confirm that it is not a spied balloon. And they can put the whole stories to bed just like that.
Yeah, that's not quite how it's playing out at the moment. How much of a problem is it going to be for China? The US have said they are reluctant to shoot it down because they're worried about debris and causing harm to the people on the ground. Of course, if it veers over a body of water or indeed the sea, then shooting it down will be an option. How much of a problem would that be for China if the Americans were able to get hold of some of the equipment that's attached to the balloon?
I suspect that the Americans would not want to do so. Not allowing the debris to fall on the ground and accidentally hit people on US soil, I'm sure was a legitimate reason. But another reason may well be that they would rather prefer not to take such a course of action because that is escalatory, that puts American surveillance planes around China at risk. And in any event, a balloon like that is unlikely to be able to get far greater, more valuable image intelligence of US installations than Chinese satellites, which are crisscrossing American airspace on a daily basis anyway.
And of course, the same goes for American low orbit satellites that are crisscrossing China's air on a daily basis. Let's look at the implications that this has on a diplomatic level. These talks were extremely important. Tell us a little bit why.
Well, the Chinese economy has been in serious trouble in the last few months. Partly it was because of its zero COVID policy, partly it was because of the increased tension between the United States and China and the kind of restrictions the US government have been imposing on China, for example, over semiconductor. So Xi Jinping already tried to ease tension by agreeing to talk to Antony Blinken if Blinken's trip had materialized. For Antony Blinken to cancel the trip, it basically pushed the objective of Xi Jinping back. And therefore, the canceling of the trip is having a major impact on Chinese policy. And perhaps that is why they insist that this really was just a meteorological balloon, not a spying balloon.
There are also those who are saying that it's quite interesting that America brought this balloon to public attention. They could have, of course, not even brought it to public attention. Can you read anything into that? There might be a suggestion that these talks are sort of quietly being sabotaged by one side or another. Do you think there's any credence in that?
Well, we have seen footages taken by people who are not working for the US Department of Defense,
Yeah, that would be tricky to
showing
refute.
the balloon in the middle of the sky over Montana.
Yeah.
So it would have been practically impossible for the US government to not acknowledge that and explain that they have. If they tried to cover that up, they would have discredited themselves. And so I don't think that really was a particularly credible explanation.
Finally, looking at the diplomacy, do we know if these talks are going to be rearranged in the not too distant future? And can China right now afford any sort of trade war, perhaps resulting from this incident, between itself and the US?
For leading trading nations, none of them can, if you like, particularly afford any trade war. They get into trade war not because they feel that they can well afford it, because of other political reasons that they have to engage in such trade war. So the Chinese would prefer not to be in a trade war with the United States, at least not one that not their own choosing. But the Chinese government under Xi Jinping will have difficulties appearing weak when dealing with the United States. So how the crisis will be resolved is not yet certain. I don't think either side particularly wants to see a complete break in relationship. So some kind of a talk probably will be rescheduled, but then there may well be conditions that needs to be met first.
Such as?
Well, I think the American side will probably want the Chinese not to be too aggressive and allow this to blow over in the United States, because we are having a democratic administration in the US at the moment, and there are very right-wing Republicans who will take on any signal from Washington that may suggest that the Biden administration is being soft on China. So they cannot afford to not react if the Chinese escalate any further. And this perhaps explains why the Chinese side has for once been trying to be finding a ways to resolve the problem without escalation.